Yeah, cool. All right. Hi, I'm Liz.
And I'm Marie, and this is Mock It, a podcast sponsored by MetroStar, where we take a deep dive into UX design trends, trending design topics, and chatting with our friends in the field. Let's get started.
Awesome. So for today's episode, we're going to be introducing the Digital Services Coalition with Traci Walker. Hi, Traci. How are you?
I'm doing well. Thank you very much.
Thanks for joining us today. And if you wouldn't mind, could you take a minute or two to introduce yourself?
So I am the executive director of the Digital Services Coalition, and I have been doing that for a year now, which is exciting. Just came up on my year anniversary.
Congrats.
Yes,
congrats.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Prior to that, I was in the government for 20 years as an IT contracting officer. And so I first was with GSA. And then in 2008, I joined the White House and did the IT contracts for the Executive Office of the President. Started at the end of the Bush administration, went through the Obama administration, and when healthcare.gov had its little snafu and USDS was created, I was brought on to help create the acquisition team. Because at the time, they looked at the problem and said it wasn't just a problem with tech, it was also a problem with the acquisition. $300 million for a system that doesn't work is not the best look, for the government. So
Not for anybody.
So at the time, I had already been doing agile software development contracts for whitehouse.gov and for some of the other systems internally. So I had already built a little bit of the knowledge around what digital services were, how to look and buy cloud, what does open source software look like, and how do I purchase that. So really trying to get ahead of the trend on that. And when the U.S. Digital Service started, I came in and created that procurement team to basically kind of bring those models and things that we saw that were successful at the White House and make them possible for the rest of the government. And I was there through 6 years and then joined the Digital Service Coalition.
Wow, you've been busy.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
So as we get into our podcast today, can you also give us a little bit of background on the DSC?
Yeah, so the Digital Services Coalition was formed officially in 2019. It started prior to that as kind of a community of practice of companies, small to mid-sized companies who got together, who were kind of frustrated with how acquisitions were always kind of being tailored towards the larger industry, the larger businesses. And as an individual company, you didn't necessarily have your own voice or your own ability to have that big of an influence on how, to get work or to show the digital service trends that were happening. A lot of times you were forced into a subcontract relationship where you might be the subject matter expertise on the contract, but you're not going to be the one taking kind of over the control of it. Mm-hmm. So I think that's where a lot of those frustrations came together. A bunch of companies got together and initially started a Slack channel, which they were able to talk about upcoming acquisitions, upcoming projects, and team together and figure that out. And so they realized that they needed to formalize that and created a nonprofit trade association, which eventually became the Digital Services Coalition. So it was originally 16 companies were the original co-founders, and now we're up to 28 companies in 2022. So
Awesome.
So for full transparency, MetroStar is a member of the team.
Yes, you are.
DSC, and also Jason Stoner, who is our director of digital experience strategy, is a board member. Mm-hmm. So I wanted to lay out the cards for everyone. And then, so for organizations to become part of the DSC, what characteristics are you looking for those that can join, or how does that process work?
So we really look for companies that have instilled their own values within their company, that really say what kind of work they want, what kind of missions they want to go after, and how they want to be perceived as a company that does digital service work. So we really focus on the kinds of companies that are the service providers, as opposed to the ones that really are making products, digital service products. And that's not to say that a company can't have their own business line that does that product building, but really this is the service providers that know how to bring in the technical subject matter expertise, like designers and, agile software developers and, DevOps. And so looking at companies that have that kind of mix of skills and understanding of what digital transformation really is, pulling that in from the commercial industry as well, not necessarily being just a government only kind of company. It has a both bonus to what we're looking for in terms of membership, because a lot of the trends and a lot of where technology goes is coming from the external to government and not necessarily being created and formed within government. We also look at companies that have that ability to really have high quality delivery and focus in on that. And that makes them really happy as a corporation to say, hey, we did this thing, we impacted this user's life, we did this, as opposed to some companies who, and there's nothing wrong with this, but just look at contracts as saying like, okay, we want to help with hiring and placing people on contracts. And that's great. We're looking for a long-term engagement. And I think the digital service companies have much more of that. Let's get something done. Let's get it working. Let's move on to the next challenge and the next project. So that culture of delivery kind of over a culture of hire and placement.
Got it. Awesome. Mm-hmm. Cool. So then a question for you about the DSC. Recently, you all have finalized the strategic plan. Did you want to give us some details on what that looks like?
Sure. So first of all, when we thought about what kind of a strategic plan we wanted to bring in, one of the things with plans is that you want to make sure it's actionable and that it's not something that you've built and then stick in a drawer and never go back to and reference. I think most of the companies, have this pattern and working processes of doing things iteratively. You test, you figure out how something works, and then you operationalize it. So that's really the basis of what we looked at and how to build the strategic plan. Was we want something that is going to grow as we grow, and not something that is so locked down and structured that we work towards the plan and work to try to, making it the only thing that we're trying to do. In reality, the plan reflects who we are and what we're trying to do as we grow. So that's where we started with that. We got together with a lot of the DSC companies and people that are involved in this, both from new companies and people who have the historical reference, and really tried to figure out who we were as a group. Again, are we, a trade association that's really looking for just business development opportunities? We realized that wasn't the case for us. So what is it that brings us together? And we really saw that the community and the ability to kind of help each other out and to also help government out, understanding digital transformation, were some of the key things that we all want to continue to try to do and help in. And so really looking and saying, how can this group steer government at all levels, not just federal, but state, local, and even international, into understanding digital service, digital transformation, and what that actually means, like to be put into practice. So pulling out the expertise and then showing that, and embodying it by the companies that we have. So that strategic plan reflects that and really goes after a lot of goals that we are looking at, to say things like membership, how do we kind of look at fundraising, what do we do for our communications, as you guys are doing a podcast, do we do a podcast? Education is a big thing. How can we educate companies who want to come into the government space? There's a lot of opportunity for that with good companies that do great work that just would look at the federal barriers and go, nope, not today, not something I want to look at. But if you had other similar companies saying, this is how we did it and here's your roadmap, it might be easier to kind of bring in or leverage or mentor those kinds of companies. As well as government, we know that there's a lot of skill building that needs to be done in government. There's a lot of understanding what is possible in terms of technology and how to implement it. And I think that, everyone in the Digital Services Coalition and also in our strategic plan is, how do we accelerate that? How do we speed that up? And how do we, continue to kind of get good work out of all the companies, but also out of government? So it's not just focused on the companies itself, but, also looking at government and how do we continue to help them change?
So that's definitely like one of MetroStar's core values of, being of service to the government. And so speaking towards some of the elements that you just brought up with partnerships and working with the companies that are part of the DSC, what are you looking for? What can companies kind of get out of being part of the DSC with a partnership and literally building that community? Mm-hmm. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Sure. One of the things we talk about a little bit internally is that we have co-opetition. And so we are competitors, but also there is cooperation. So where you're looking at having the kinds of people, when you have a good conversation with somebody and you're both, firing away and you understand what they're talking about and they get what you're trying to go after. And even though you might be competing on the same thing, you both understand that you're at the same level and you have the same ideas around what that outcome is going to be. So really understanding that mentality of bringing in and similar companies that have similar, we already talked about it, but values, but operating practices and discussions around, diversity and inclusion and methods of hiring. All things are very similar. And so there's a lot of knowledge exchange within the organization. So that's part of the value. I think another part of the value of the DSC is also the connections that we do have within government. We do have strong connections with U.S. Digital Service, with Technology Transformation Service over at GSA, other groups that are forward thinking in terms of digital transformation. And so having that network as well is very important, so that you can talk to people in government as well, and everybody kind of understands the same language. And that's a big factor when you're looking at how do I do work, how do I get work, and then how do I be successful with the work that we do get in the government. So there's a lot of value add around that. And I think, again, going back to the community piece, how do we encourage the values, internally from a company, but also how do we represent ourselves to other people and giving models for people to look at and say, oh, that company's great, or those people are great. Who are they with? And then trickling it back to being a part of the Digital Services Coalition and having not the badge of honor, but just saying I'm proud of the fact that we are part of something that is bigger than our own company and bigger than ourselves. So as we grow, hopefully that's really what people can get out of it. Sorry.
Oh, no, that's awesome. I really I like the twin co-opetition. I was like, oh, that's awesome.
Well, it's better than the term frenemies, which also has been applied, but co-opetition is a much more elegant way of saying that, I think. So,
yeah, rolls off the tongue very nicely.
Exactly.
So as we get a little bit more specific, and now that we have a little bit more background from the DSC, in your words, why do you think it's so important that design moves into the government space with modernization?
I have a very specific example of this. When I worked in one of my previous agencies, we worked on an ERP implementation back in the 2000s. So that's a massive system changeover, and you bring in a new commercial off-the-shelf solution, COTS product. And out of the box, it had a lot of terms that were very commercial-based and not specific to government. And so things like a purchase order in the commercial space is very specific to, okay, this is in our system, we're having this, and this is what the back-end language of this is. In government space, a purchase order is a very narrowly defined thing, and it's part of a contract type of series. And so when we rolled it out to end users within the government, everyone was like, oh, well, this isn't a purchase order, this is a contract. Or I'm trying to do a delivery order. Why does it say purchase order? Yeah. So the fact that they kind of made choices to put design on the back end and not as the first thing that really was going to be part of the successful implementation of it. It was always one of those oh, we'll get to it next in the, we need to get our initial operating capabilities out the door and the system running and not worry about the design piece. It took about 3 or 4 months for all of the end users to revolt and say, we're not doing this. We can't use this. It's too complex. It's too complicated. You have to give me a huge manual. It takes me 15 clicks to do this, and it took me 5 clicks to do it in my old system. And it wasn't just a matter of upgrading and going to new technology. It really was about the fact that it wasn't designed to help them with their business process. So I learned that in the 2000s before design and UX and all of that really came out as something that you should or be putting the emphasis on. Mm-hmm. And as that has come out now, it's really interesting to see that is a conversation that starts happening at the beginning of these projects and not something that's tacked on at the end. And how do you thoughtfully think about what it is that you are trying to put in front of people as technology? And I think also with the wave and how we access everything now through some form of digital service with our smartphones, with our computers, with our day-to-day lives, that there's a huge, understanding that is the new norm. And people are going to expect that their technology comes to them in a delivery package that they can understand, that they don't need a manual for, that they don't need special training on, that they don't, that they can get intuitively. And there's a lot of things that go in with that, but then you also have to look at how secure does the system have to be. And when security and design questions come up, they usually are very handled very differently. So design might be like, we have to do it this way, and security is looking at it going like, that's going to break security. So how do you make something functional as well as secure? And, the technical answers may not be the best for how somebody's actually going to use it. So a lot of that is kind of bringing that upfront thinking in. And it's more than just, as we always say, more than just making it look pretty, but how is it actually accomplishing the business process? And that's a big part of the design process that is now being brought in. And I think probably the most key thing about, digital transformation and digital service is thinking of it in that holistic way, and not just, I can go build something and put something together and here's your answer. But is it actually going to solve the problem that somebody has and do it in a way that makes sense to them?
Yeah. Words to my ears, right? I love them. But I think you brought up a very interesting point. Liz and I have talked about before, but language matters for the context of your audience, whether, it's your team or the end user. How they were using the words, because in commercial it meant one thing, but then government was using another. You have to dive in and know your users just from that point, from the beginning, because it can, I know sometimes I get thrown because my head is like the design understanding of language, and not all those words mean the same to like PMs or our stakeholders.
I was kind of laughing at you because, or not at you, but like smiling at you because when you were talking about language, like we on the projects that we work with, it's definitely like language is a huge thing. It's not just semantics. It's really like, it's very specific that this means this to this group of stakeholders and users. Whereas like to your point, like, in commercial, it could be totally different. And like, you really have to go in knowing your user and tailoring it to what their expectations are and their use of whatever the product or app or whatever it is. So I was laughing towards it. I was like, oh, Marie's
so we have had lots of conversations and even other like user interviews who have like brought up how important language is.
One of the new things that you can see now is that the government, there is an independent group actually doing a scorecard or a report card on plain language usage in the government. And so you can find that on like Digital Gov and see where people have rated what agencies are doing in terms of their plain language. So just even understanding which agencies are further ahead with that, there was a big movement and a big trend to really embrace and take plain language into it. And so I think looking at how content designers and people are looking at that is a big thing now, because there are people watching the government and rating it on this stuff. So you can see there were several A's and several F's. And so like, okay, not a lot in between. So very interesting to see how agencies are adopting that and bringing that in.
Yeah. Cool. Yeah. And that's something that we also play with the plain language. Some of the stuff can be very technical to, like you're in your field. So it, like this is called XYZ. And like to a normal person, you don't understand an acronym. You don't know like the background. You might not understand fully what the words mean in the acronym, or like your understanding of the word is different from actually how it's being used. So we go through that a lot with having to break down like an expert's understanding and like free form to, like a new user, and like really bringing them up to speed in like a friendly way. So yeah, it is a challenge. It's a fun challenge, and it's good that it's becoming very accessible for people. So I think that's been like a nice sort of, we're reaching a lot of people because we're making it accessible. So,
I just said for sure. So I can ask the next question. So design leadership has been a hot topic, and it's been changing in like our organizations about designers having a seat at the table. How can companies embrace design internally and become a design first company?
I think, we're seeing a lot more a trend where it starts with leadership in corporations, where you have a design lead or a VP of design or somebody understanding at that level that design is important and needs to be carried out throughout the entire company, but also seeing how it plays within the building and the, understanding what the tech is going to be done. I think that a lot of times there is still the challenge of when does design need to come in to the conversation. And there are some companies who are design only firms, and there are some companies who've blended it all together and say, hey, we want to be everything. So understanding what is your specific kind of design need and what does that look like to pair and do a continuous build. Because one of the things that both government needs to understand, as well as, the digital transformation look, is that software development isn't going to end for whatever the project is that you're working on. So if you're like, okay, we need design up front, and that's great, and you've got something, in there, well, how's it still going to continue to go when you've released something into people's hands? What does that look like? So knowing that there's a place for design, not only at the beginning, but throughout the entire thing, and how do you thread that through, is a big corporate strategy, I think, that companies need to look at and talk about and are having those discussions about, as opposed to, oh, yeah, we've got some designers, we're good. We've checked the box.
Yeah.
It's changing now to that is, coming up more and more in terms of, okay, we need discovery. We've launched a minimum viable product. We've got something in people's hands. But now what's the strategy to go back and say, how do we change this? Do we continue going on what we thought our backlog was going to be, or do we go look at what people are facing when they're actually using our stuff? And that's a big strategy discussion as well. And when you're looking at how do you build a solicitation around that, how do you build a response from a company, those are going to be the things that separate people. And when you're looking at the solutions that people come out, how do you handle design? How do you bring in user research? Those are things that people want to have a good understanding of. And if you don't know it from your corporate level, how are you going to know it from a working level? And so understanding that kind of threads through an entire organization is a little bit different than I think, even 5 or 10 years ago, where it always was okay, we've got a bunch of, engineers, they should be able to figure out all the problems and do that. But that's not really where the business process design questions, or what is people's emotional response to a solution is. And they're not necessarily, and it's nothing, no shade on engineers. I'm the daughter of an engineer. But they're very problem solving. This is a thing, but let's solve the problem. And we've done what that looks like. But that doesn't necessarily really give you that whole experience that you're kind of looking for. So understanding where that comes in is, I think, the trend, and where companies are going to have to start on bringing that in to the conversations they have at that strategic level.
I feel like I've learned a lot, working. So Maria's a design manager. I feel like one of the things I've really learned from working with you is that, it's just that point. It's okay to start somewhere, but then really iterate and dig into where people are. And if that changes where people are, we just, go back to the discovery phase. And it's okay to be sort of our boss calls us Gumbies,
Right.
And that's being comfortable in that is something that you definitely own and have taught others on the team to be like that. And it's okay.
Yeah.
Well, I think that's a question, back to you guys as a digital service, firm. Where is it with what you guys do, and how do you guys talk about it from that perspective?
Yeah. Well, we have definitely been able to have both design and development is very early on in the process. We've gone through some growing pains of, trying to figure it out and navigate it, where we got design there early because I come from the design background, but then noticing that we thought we fixed the problem, and another peeled back the onion of, well, actually it would be beneficial to have our lead developer there too, that even if it's just him taking in the information. So the first time he's getting it is 3 months ahead of we ever talk about it again. But, that translation of knowledge and information and understanding of the user's problems is just more rich in understanding. Mm-hmm. But yeah, and then I think really, like Liz said, I've been a really big encourager of, I don't know where we've come out in society, or maybe it's from coming from school, I have to have the right best idea as my first idea. And I know in design, they always talk about your first idea is never the best, but for some reason, when you get into the job, there's you're scared of making the first mark on the paper. So I just, great, we have a safe space. I just really encourage the team to throw out ideas, throw together mock-ups or whatever it might be, just to start. Because I feel like once you that whiteboard is not white anymore, it's so much more friendly to iterating and getting to those better ideas, or just getting you to ask the more thoughtful questions because you're processing while you're doing that.
Mm-hmm.
I think also we've been lucky with having a respectful team, to your safe space. Like you can have a really rough idea up on the board, and it's okay. We can jump off on that spot, or we can scratch it all together, and it's not no one is being a jerk, being we can't start there from for a development reason or for a design reason. We need to maybe take a step back. People want to work towards the goal together, and I think that we've been lucky with kind of to all leads from our previous podcast that we had, the jerkometer.
Yeah.
People aren't jerks, and it's okay to have differing opinions and kind of coming together. But I think you really lead the charge with that first little ink drop. We can grow from there, or we can erase it, and it's totally cool.
Yeah. I think that leads to one of the big differences around digital service and what has been in the government is that shift from the waterfall mentality to the agile development mentality, where you had to create the requirements for under waterfall pretty much in a vacuum. Mm-hmm. You had to list them all out. You had to think through what are all possible permutations of a system or a solution without actually having real evidence to support what is being said for what a solution has to do. And then you package that up and you say, okay, here's our requirements. Now go build this. And that always ended up in delays and, kind of overruns on time, because what that vision was in somebody's head and what they put down, first of all, probably that requirements team wasn't even the people who were implementing it. And then the people who are implementing it probably have no ability to really influence what those requirements are, because they're hard coded in. And when there's failure on that, then it becomes the blame game of, well, did you understand the requirement enough, or did you just implement it poorly? And that's very hard to figure out, especially when you're looking at a very large project. So when you're breaking things down to increments and looking at the smaller failures is not a bad failure as opposed to a much bigger failure.
Yeah.
And government does have a challenge with the concept and the idea of what failure looks like. So talking about understanding how does design encourage failure up front and first really helps, I think, break down those barriers a little bit, because it's talking about failure of the solution to meet the problem, not failure of the contract, and not failure of the whole thing. And if you learn that up front first and you build in that process, then even as you go along, those failures don't add up the same way they used to, or people aren't as we can decide, we can look at it and say, was this a problem with our design? Or sometimes it is a personnel issue. Maybe somebody just wasn't as skilled or needed to have some more skills to raise their level of understanding of how to meet that specific challenge that they're presented. It's a lot easier to figure that out in these projects and stuff now than it used to be, especially with a huge amount of work and everything that you have to be we have to get this done. And that's usually where design and the outcome and the output always went by the wayside. You're the technical requirement has to be done first, and then whether or not somebody can use it well was always second.
Figure it out.
Exactly. We'll throw it together, we'll put a mask on it, Band-Aid, tape, MacGyver it, and we're good to go. Okay, so I think that's changed a lot for the better.
Nice.
Awesome. Well, I feel it's kind of going into more of narrowing down, and we have you for another podcast. So I'm going to, if you're okay with this.
Yeah, for sure.
I'm going to end this sort of segment with a question that we are asking everyone for season 2. And that question is, what is the most promising thing you've seen with the progression of design in government?
I think from the holistic standpoint of, if I stand back from where we were when I joined USDS in 2014 and where we are today, the thing that I have been most impressed with probably is the web design standards. The idea that you go to a government website and it looks and has the same feel as every other agency is a huge deal for when people interfacing with the government do not understand necessarily that all of these different agencies and all of these different practices are not just one big government. And the web design standards, I think, have come out to kind of say, like, there's a modernized look and feel. There's accessibility that's brought into it. There's ways for agencies to use it where they don't have to, it's made it easy for them to build and to put things out. And having that is a huge step forward for that consistency that you get across government agencies. So when you go to one site, it looks very similar, and the navigation is similar, and the buttons are similar, and the tabs are similar. And when you do that, then people feel more comfortable with, oh, this looks just like what I'm used to seeing. Whereas prior to that, agencies had no real consistency, and it was all over. And I might even go within same sub agencies within the same agency and find completely different like web patterns and ways to access information and data. And that became very frustrating for people because I think most people just want that easy button now because we're getting it in so many other ways. And so we're so used to that from our everyday lives that when it now is being, I think that gap has decreased with the tolerance that the public or people have with government systems and solutions now, with saying tech is there. Why is this not working yet? And so I think as those consistent things, that really helps with both lowering costs overall on government projects when you can use the same thing again and again and again. And then, hopefully building trust and, or at least letting people know that this is a government website. You are going to see similar things, and hopefully you can navigate to where you are needing to go on that site, as opposed to being worried about like, where's the button that I'm trying to find or something along those lines, or where's the login, where's this stuff. So that's probably been the biggest, I think, thing overall that I'd say probably been the most proud of in the digital transformation world, is seeing that and, somewhat being a part of it. But I'm going to give more credit to like the 18F and the USDS designers. But from the contracting perspective, we always were like, okay, now to the greatest extent possible, use the web design standards on our contracts. So requiring that as part of the process too was a big thing as well. So
nice.
Awesome. Well, one last question before we go into part 2 of this. Where can people find the DSC on social media?
So we have a website, the digitalservicescoalition.org. That's all one word, Digital Services Coalition. We also have LinkedIn and are on Twitter. So that's pretty much probably our main way to get a hold of us.
Awesome. Well, I'm going to thank you for joining us for this podcast and introducing the DSC to us. And with that, this was Mocket. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and share with your friends. If you're interested in learning more about how tech and government collide, visit MetroStar.com and follow us on our socials.